Hello, BookTube. A couple of years ago, I did a video on 10 tips for book reviewing in response to a lot of questions along those lines that I'd gotten from quite a few of you. And in the intervening time, I've shown that video to some people, and I've watched it again myself. And a lot of the people that I showed it to were book critics. They were book reviewers themselves. And the universal uh, impression of that video was that it wasn't really entry level. And when I watched the video again, of course, I saw that that was true. There's lots of talk about editors and header material and deadlines and word count and whatnot. It occurred to me that when I talk about, as I do often on this channel, talk about formal book reviewing, that maybe I could do a video of tips that are more basic, more entry level than, never miss your deadline under any circumstances and things like that. So I jotted down some of those tips, but I want to preface this video uh, with the same kind of bona fides that I gave in the earlier video, which is why you should pay attention to me when I talk on this subject if you're going to. And there are two main things. The first one is one that I mentioned in that earlier video and stressed, which is that I myself am a book reviewer. I'm a professional book reviewer. And by that I mean that I am not a working book reviewer. A working book reviewer is someone who always has a paying job in hand, a paying commission in hand, who goes from one to the next, but who has, so to speak, a day job. I don't. I am a professional book critic, a professional book reviewer in that I do nothing else. That's what I do. I don't have a day job. I don't have a lecture circuit gig. I don't have a teaching position. I don't have anything like that. This is all that I do. And when you look at it that way, I'm one of a very small number. It once upon a time was far more common. Now there's a very, very small number. I bet you could count them on the fingers of one hand of people who only do that, who are just professional book reviewers and nothing else. The industry just doesn't tend to support it anymore. So that's one thing. Another bona fide is that for a very long time, and then there was 25 years where I wasn't, and then for a very long time before that, I was also a book review section editor, dealing with people who had very varying levels of expertise in what they were doing in terms of freelancers submitting work or pitching reviews. So I know both sides of that equation. And when I was thinking about this video, I'm thinking about the things that are far more basic than a lot of the things that I went through in that last video. I came up with a small list that I wanted to go over with you. There'll be some bleed through between the two. We won't be talking about editors. We won't be talking about commissions or deadlines or anything like that. But in this video, we will still be talking about word count. There's no real sense in giving you tips on the most rarefied kind of book reviewing imaginable, like when you write 4,000 words for the New York Review of Books and you haul in Lacan and Derrida so that you can earn your thousands. Stuff like that is very rare. A formal book review, even if it's for an unpaid place like Goodreads or Amazon, is still going to be around 800 words. So we're going to use that as just a convenient bracket. 800 words. It takes, believe it or not, and those of you who are writers will probably believe it, it takes an exceptional amount more skill to do that same job in a much smaller amount of words. You might think, oh God, I can't wait for this word count to be over. 300 would be a blessing, but no, not if you're going to do the job. It's 10 times harder. But 800 is about the size that a book review tends to be in a magazine, in a newspaper, whatever. So we'll stick to a rough word count of 800. And for convenience sake here, we will talk about reviewing fiction mostly. The tips that I have in mind here can be expanded to nonfiction, but formal reviews of nonfiction are a little rarer. Nonfiction is not nearly as much read as fiction, so we'll stick mainly to that just for convenience sake. But these things can be adapted to both, and to help things out, I will be using an example, and I believe it or not, I mulled in front of my bookshelves to figure out an example novel, because it's no good for me to talk about these things in the abstract. I want to show you what I mean. So I picked a novel. I'm sure that it's familiar to most of you. Probably quite a few of you have read it. It's Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. Okay, so that will be our example, and that's the book that I'll be fumbling with while I go through these just basic book reviewing givens that maybe aren't given, that maybe we could go over them together just to make sure, especially since, there is a pointed element to all of this. In addition to having been a book section editor for many years, I am currently a book section editor for Open Letters Review, and I'm constantly on this channel saying to all of you that you ought to try your hand at book reviewing. And the results that I get from that, I don't get nearly as many as I should. You should all still try your hand at book reviewing. You have a wide open venue at your disposal. But the submissions that I get for that range all over the map. Some of them, people who have clear aptitude and just don't know the very basics, or some of them. Others who don't know anything at all outside of Goodreads, for instance, where participants in that website are encouraged to put reviews down on the site. But the stuff that turns up on Goodreads, as you know perfectly well, I'm sure you pay more attention to Goodreads than I do, but the stuff that shows up there is very seldom what you could call a formal book review. Like, for instance, one of the axioms that I did in that previous video from a couple of years ago definitely holds true in this video for a formal book review, which is that you personally have no place in the review. It is not part of a formal book review for you to say, I felt this about while reading this book, unless in very rare instances it is actually germane to the review. No one knows who you are, and your readers don't care who you are. So you're not telling anyone anything useful to give your emotional, personal, individual reactions to a book. A book review doesn't do that. A book review has other things that it has its eye on doing. But for instance, that would bleed over. But we're going to start with the very basics. And I've listed here 8. But as with all the lists that I make, they are not ranked in order. The only one of these numbers that actually has a numerical place is number 1. Nothing can be number 1 except number 1. So the number 1 basic for a book review is to tell your reader what it is that you're reviewing. And you might think that that's self-evident, but it is not. What I have seen in the course of my 28 years from submissions all over the map, it is not a given. And it's not a fault of thinking, it's just a fault of experience, that's all. The very first thing you need to do in your review, aside from perhaps a snappy opening line if you feel so confident, the very first main thing that you need to do in a book review is tell your audience, tell your readers what it is that you're reviewing. And that, I don't mean just naming it. You must not assume that your reader knows anything about what you're writing about. And so you must tell them about it. And keep in mind, always in the back of your mind in this whole video, 800 words. That's all you've got to do any of this. Let's say that's carved in stone. It's not, because we're not talking about professional book reviewing here for the moment. So that's not carved in stone. It's a free country. You could always write 8,000 words if you wanted. But let's say, just because it helps to concentrate the mind, let's say 800 words. So you can't take up much of that in telling your reader what the book is that you're reviewing. So let's take this, Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. What is this? Before you start talking about it, what is it? Okay, it is a thriller. It is a police procedural thriller about the hunt for a serial killer. And the next thing that flows naturally from that is to tell your reader a little bit about the author. This is extra important when you're doing nonfiction because the author's credentials will be important, but it's important for fiction too, unless it's not. I mean, if you're writing a formal book review of the 50th Dragonlance book by Anne McCaffrey, you don't really need to spend any time on who she is, except to say that she's written 49 other. But in Thomas Harris's case, for instance, once you have told the reader what this is in clear and detailed prose that doesn't take up a lot of space, this is a police procedural thriller about the hunt for a serial killer. You can elaborate on that if you want. You can expand on that and say that the main character is a former FBI investigator who has a weird empathetic bond with the thought processes of serial killers, and that has taken such a toll on him that he has left the agency. The agency, faced with what they now know is a new serial killer who is working on a lunar cycle, so they have a deadline of the next full moon, desperate to save whoever his next victim will be, have reached out to this investigator, Will Graham, to try and bring him in as a consultant on the case. Okay, if you expand it that much, and keep in mind, those words that I just said are too long. They're fine for conversation, but they are too long on the written page. You have to do all of that far shorter than that, because you have a lot of ground to cover with this book. So that flows naturally. That expanded, what is this book? So that your reader knows this is not, a Julia Child recipe book. This is not a history of Operation Overlord. This is a police procedural serial killer novel. Okay, once you have grounded your reader on that so that you know where you are, the next natural step is to tell them about the author if any of the author's details are important to the review. And that is true in this case, because this book, Red Dragon, came out in 1981. And Thomas Harris's previous book, his debut novel, Black Sunday, came out in, I think, 1977. 1973. So that's almost 10 years. That's a long time in between books. And also important to point out when you talk about this author, you could mention that he comes from an extensive journalist background, but once you've read the book, you might decide that's not germane. It doesn't really come through. Or you might decide that it is. There's lots of insider lingo in this book. It could be that Harris picked it up there. But the important thing about talking about the author and his previous work is that Black Sunday bears no relation to this whatsoever. That brief thumbnail description I just gave of Red Dragon does not apply to Black Sunday at all. And another thing that you could mention early when talking about that fact, when mentioning that Black Sunday doesn't bear any relation, his debut novel is nothing like his second novel. You could also mention that Black Sunday is a little bit absurd. It's a debut novel. It did well, but it's a little bit silly. It's overdone. It's not particularly realistic. And you can, if you want, draw a comparison between that and the hyper-realism of Red Dragon. Maybe this book is in part the author's reaction to that. But one way or another, the second basic here, once you've told the reader what this book is, the second basic is to tell them who the author is. Tell them about the author. And then the third point, again, this will apply to fiction and nonfiction. It would be slightly different. In fiction, you have to recapitulate the plot. In nonfiction, it would be the argument of the book, the setting, the historical background. It's 10 times harder to do when you only have 800 words, because keep in mind, way in the back here, you have a stopper. You have 800 words. But it's no walk in the park to engagingly and completely summarize the plot of a book either. That's not as easy as it sounds at all. The Ron Charles, who writes book reviews for the Washington Post, satirically refers to himself as his satirical job description for himself is someone who summarizes the plots of literary novels. And one of the reasons that he does that is because it does sometimes feel like that's mostly what you're doing. And that takes up space. You only have so much space. And so when you finish reading the book and maybe finish rereading the book and you're ready to write your review, if you think I only have 800 words, which I argue, even if you have all the words in the world, it's very healthy for you to think I only have 800 words. If you think that, then immediately you start dropping off dozens of points and observations that you want to make about the book because they won't fit. You have to decide what you want to say about the book. And when you know what you want to say about the book, you then realize that that has to shape your plot summary. There are all sorts of things that are happening in the book that you have to just ignore. Your plot summary has to quietly set up the things you want to say about the book. It has to be a through line. But that's the next thing, is to summarize the plot and to do it engagingly and to do it extremely concisely. And believe it or not, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, that is the single hardest learnable skill of this whole procedure. Writing your opinions in clear, readable prose doesn't take as much work as fairly summarizing a large work in a paragraph or two. Fairly and engagingly summarizing a large work in a paragraph or two it's a learned skill and it's difficult. So that is the next thing. And then you want to say, somewhere in this beginning, you want to say how the book compares to its kinfolk. Situate it not only in terms of telling your reader what it is, what's going on inside it, and who the author is, but also in terms of telling something about the broader spectrum on which it appears. This this is one of the X factors of writing a formal book review, because that step right there requires expertise, and a newcomer will not have it. And that's just as simple as that. You have to gain that expertise by reading an enormous amount. And that little element there, sometimes no more than a sentence, will often be the determining factor on whether or not your reader comes back to you a second time. If you say, in terms of its kinfolk, if you set this a new book of, I don't even know, World War II historical fiction on a spectrum, and you say, this is by far the most detailed and exhaustively researched piece of World War II historical fiction that has appeared in the last 50 years, and you're saying this about a French spy thriller, and appear to be ignorant of The Winds of War, The Naked and the Dead, whatever, the readers who aren't ignorant of that are going to know that you have bitten off more than you can chew, that you're writing beyond your expertise. Same thing applies 10 times over with history. But you'll notice it in a book review. If you follow book reviewers, you'll notice it. You'll notice a book reviewer who has a particular column in a newspaper or who appears regularly somewhere else. You'll notice when they know what they're talking about, when they can easily and quickly mention the kinfolk of what they're talking about, to give you a better feeling if you know that kinfolk as well. Like, for instance, other serial killer novels. When it comes to Red Dragon, By Reason of Insanity is the big one that comes to mind. But there are a couple of others. You shouldn't belabor it. You don't have all that room. Only 800 words back here and coming up faster all the time. But you can add a little bit of texture there. And then you move on to the tricky part, which is to give examples of the book. It is absolutely not fair to review a book without letting it speak for itself directly to your readers. That absolutely is not fair. And I know this for a fact because there have been many, many, many book reviews that I have read in venues from the New York Times all the way down the line, where the reviewer is banging on for 400 words about how boring and derivative the writer's prose is, and then when they quote from it, I don't see that. And it makes me distrust the reviewer, and it also makes me want to seek out the book and tell for myself. And the reason it's tricky is because that 800-word limit that we've set for ourselves is increasing. It's coming faster and faster at us as we get all this stuff done. Even the basics that I've talked about now, for a reasonably complex novel, this is a reasonably complex novel. It's a reasonably complex style of execution and subgenre of mystery novel. We're talking out of 800, probably 250, 275 words have already been spent just on that. So I'll try not to talk about editors here. An editor will have a very strict idea of how much you can quote and how much you can't. But let's say you don't have an editor. If you set yourself at 800 words, you still have to be careful of how much you quote, and you have to pick it accordingly. It's perfectly okay for the quotes that you pick to come from the beginning of the book. It's perfectly okay also for you to freight your plot summary for the beginning of the book. There's always a worry here, and it's not an illegitimate one at all, that you will spoil the book if you say too much. That's totally legitimate. That authors complain about that, readers complain about that, and you shouldn't do it. And there are 8,000 ways to avoid it without seeming like you're avoiding it, without going out of your way to pussyfoot around the corpse in the middle of the room. There are 8,000 ways to do it. But that will dictate some of what you choose. So, for instance, when you're going through your book, you will be making notes. You'll either be writing in the book, or you'll be writing in a notepad, or you'll be leaving those little adhesive tabs, or you'll be, God forbid, turning down the pages. And you will notice parts that you either want to quote or that you want to use. So we'll go just at the beginning here of Red Dragon. There's a point, the profiler, the FBI profiler who's been brought back into the case, Will Graham, has gone alone at night to the house, the crime scene of the latest dead family, the Leeds family. And he's walking around, making notes of his own. The place has already been exhaustively gone over by the police, but he's hoping that he will see something, that his old instincts will prick up. And he's slowly starting to reimagine the scene just from the effects all around him. And there's a line that is, it's 2 sentences. It's a 2-sentence paragraph One of the things you'll note here is that Thomas Harris often has short paragraphs, one sentence, two sentences. You could, in your review, link that to his journalistic background. Also, might be worth mentioning, it creates a very headlong, staccato feel of reading. But at one point, we get the lines, "Madness came into this house through that door into this kitchen, moving on size 11 feet. Sitting in the dark, he," that's Graham, "sensed madness like a bloodhound sniffs a shirt." Now, those two lines are short enough to quote, and they give the reader a sense that that is not, for instance, that is not Ed McBain writing at all. That's that has a flair to it, almost a poetry to it, that is probably worth your while to bring to your reader's attention. But later on, I want to read you something else. This is the kind of thing that will inform your description of the book, but that you cannot quote in your review. And it's this. This is another paragraph. I think this is just 3 sentences, but it's something that, well, you'll see what I mean. The increase in serotonin and free histamine levels in the gunshot wound indicated that she, that's Mrs. Leeds, had lived at least 5 minutes after she was shot. The histamine was much higher than the serotonin, so she had not lived more than 15 minutes. Most of her other injuries were probably, but not conclusively, post-mortem. And you notice, okay, so that paragraph is meant to signal to you, that happens early in the book, that's meant to signal you that there's a lot of technical expertise that Harris has mastered. But it's also meant to signal something else, which is that he's not willing to explain that expertise to you. We're told, what was it? The histamine was much higher than the serotonin, so she had not lived more than 15 minutes. But it's not explained why that would be so. You're supposed to take his word for that. That is, we are partially in the mind of Will Graham, and he is thinking those things and remembering them from a police report. So that tells you something, right? That tells you something about the way this book will be written, the pitch that it will take towards its audience. And although that quote is too long for you to use in your review, you can still think about it. You can still mention that that is the case. That is a good indicator of the book, which those of you who've read it will know that there's quite a bit of technical stuff in here. None of it is delved into. None of it is explained. And then there's another bit. This is the last thing I'll quote from you. It's way too long to use in your review, but it is crucial to your review. You have to find a way to use part of it and to summarize the rest. This is the very first insight that we get into Will Graham. It's crucial to him. It's crucial to the whole book. Graham had a lot of trouble with taste. Often his thoughts were not tasty. There were no effective partitions in his mind. What he saw when he learned and touched everything, what he saw and learned touched everything else he knew. Some of the combinations were hard to live with, but he could not anticipate them, could not block and repress. His learned values of decency and propriety tagged along, shocked at his associations, appalled at his dreams. Sorry that in the bone area of his skull there were no forts for what he loved. His associations came at the speed of light. His value judgments were at the pace of a responding reading. They could never keep up and direct his thinking. That is not only beautifully written, but it's also a perfect skewering of this character. Very helpful to your reader. You have to find a way to work something like that in. But in terms of the rest of the book, a lot of original readers of this book when it came out were fascinated by the character of Hannibal Lecter, who is not the serial killer. He enters into a sort of furtive and entirely grotesque correspondence with the serial killer, but he's not the serial killer, and he also has no direct part in the enormously affecting personal struggle of the serial killer, who is, as we're told much later in the book, trying to stop. Lecter is a side character, in other words. He has 3 scenes in the whole book, but they are arresting. It would be hindsight of the grossest kind to do a review of this now and say that those scenes indicate that he would have books of his own later on. They don't. The original readers of the book didn't think that, but they were nevertheless struck by him. And the horrible arithmetic here is that as striking as those scenes are, with Hannibal Lecter in his cell talking about he was watching the news about God dropping a roof of a church on 300 groveling worshippers, that God always stays ahead, the clear implication being that Hannibal Lecter thinks God is the best serial killer of them all. Those moments and the key part that Lecter plays in the events of the end of the book are tempting to a reviewer, and that temptation must be ignored. horrible thought to think, especially in hindsight. We know what's coming. We know an Oscar, a plate of Oscars, a famous performance, multiple movies, multiple books. It's tempting. But Hannibal Lecter, for instance, in the review of this book, should not feature prominently. Maybe not even be named. That's the sort of thing, those are the sorts of red herrings that you have to resist if you're thinking about 800 words. So the quoting is tricky. You have to do it. You have to let the author speak for himself. Think of those quotes that I just read you. What if I had told you at the beginning of my review what if I just assumed a tired tone and said, well, here we are again with another hackneyed serial killer novel, another police procedural with dogged gumshoes chasing down every minute little clue. And you're nodding along at that part in the early part of the review. You're nodding along, thinking, "Oh yeah, I've read books like that in one ear and out the other. I barely remember them." And then I quote one of those lines. If you're paying attention to the book review, you will say, "Wait a minute, that's not hackneyed at all. That doesn't read like anything I've ever read." And you'd be right. So the quotes are important, but they're tricky because they eat up space. And then when you're done with your examples, and when you're done with your summary, and when you're done with the putting it on a spectrum of its kinfolk and talking about the author, and you're done with all of that, you want to progress the reader through the book, not as a book report, but as a kind of qualitative assessment as the book goes along. Now, those of you who know the novel Red Dragon will know that it has a kicker of a false ending. And that's important for your review, because you have to manage the near impossible feat of assessing whether or not that kicker of a false ending is effective without giving it away. That's tricky. It will require work to do and experience, practice to do. But you can't rightfully leave it completely unsignaled in your review, especially if, in your opinion, it is not done well. There are quite a few reviewers of this book when it first came out who thought that false ending was totally implausible. I was almost one of them. Harris, I thought he was going to forget one key detail, and at the very last minute he doesn't. So I didn't care one way or another because of it. But once you're done with all of that, those are the basics of book reviewing. You have to tell your reader what the book is. Tell them who the author is. Give them the gist of the plot. Give them a taste of the plot. Give them a feel for where the book lands on a spectrum. If it's epic fantasy, what epic fantasy does it resemble? What epic fantasy does it, very importantly, not resemble? Once you've done all of that and you've given them some quotes, then it's time to wrap things up with a parting judgment call where you put your reputation on the line. There's no use at that point saying it may be, it might be, time will tell, we shall see. It's no use doing any of that. What you have to do then, in your parting, as you're leaving, is put your reputation on the line and put this book in its place. That's the part where you tell your reader whether or not the book is worth their time. And there's nothing more important that a book reviewer can do than that. A book essayist doesn't care one way or another. A literary critic of formal academic literary criticism doesn't care one way or another. That's the book reviewer's job. To marshal all of that compression and insight and, sifting together to tell the reader whether or not the book is worth their time. And that's what you do at the end. You leave by wrapping things up, by saying, this is what the book is. I've shown you, I've taken you through it as much as I can without spoiling it for you. And now I'm going to tell you if it's worthwhile or not. And then you're done with the basics of a book review at 800 words. And the only thing that's left for you to do, the last tip that I want to give you today, is the hardest one of all, which is to go back and make all of that really good reading. The thing that people don't tend to remember about book reviewing is that it's a form of writing on its own. It's not just a response to a form of writing. It is a kind of writing on its own, and it will have your name on it. So it's your job to make it not only good prose, but interesting and, if possible, entertaining from start to finish. Not just at the end, but also the summary. All of it entertaining. And that kind of wraps up what I thought of as just the basics of book reviewing. That is the basic approach to what you are doing when you review a book. Just A couple of other housekeeping things. You know, one would be, uh, don't assume a highfalutin tone that you don't have in real life. Write your book review. In fact, write everything. But let's concentrate on book reviews for now. Write your book review the way you would write an email to a friend. Don't use constructions that you don't ordinarily use. Don't use words that you don't ordinarily use. Let your voice come through. Think of book reviewers, of booktubers that you like, and imagine what you think back on their book reviews, right? Like for instance, Olive, at a Book Olive. Think about how she channels her voice when she's doing a book review. It's got her poise, it's got her intelligence, it's got her finished nature. There's no wandering around, there's no ums and ahs. It's pointed, not in a strict way, but in a very finished way, a very professional way. Or think about Britta Bowler and her channel. When she's talking about a book, like Olive, like anybody else on BookTube who does this sort of thing, she will talk about the characters, she will talk about the writing, she will talk about the pacing. But what's the thing she says most often? What's the thing she concentrates on most often? The word work. Does it work? Does this work? Does that work? And if it doesn't, she's ruthless about exposing how it doesn't. And that's why. And that's the variant that I want to stress here. That is what takes the place of the single individual. The thing I remember, I started by saying that you personally have no place in a book review. You don't. But you can still be there. It's still written by you. It's just that's the way you come through. By what you emphasize, by what you look for, by what you bring forward in your review. Not by saying, you know, I had a head cold when I reviewed this, so, you know, take my judgment with a grain of salt or anything like that. But rather a repeated tick that your readers over time will come to associate with you. Here's a book reviewer who maybe doesn't concentrate quite so much on whether or not the book is thrilling, but who, boy oh boy, knows the material. So that's what I'll concentrate on for that book reviewer. Here's a book reviewer who may not give as much attention to the latest political niceties in a narrative, but who will definitely tell me if there are plot holes. So I will pay attention to that in a review. That's, if you want yourself expressed in a piece of writing, that's how it happens in a book review. So that, as I've said a few times, it gets to the point where with the book reviewers who you read regularly, you could take their name off the review and you would still know who it was. That's what you want to go for. Not so much, you know, I just got in from the back 40 and now I'm sitting down to write this review. And I got to tell you, this book kind of made me sick. That's a book response, and it's certainly worthy of a kind. I read lots of stuff like that on Goodreads and Amazon. But we're talking here about a formal book review where that has no place, where you are assessing a book in its basics in order to tell a reader whether or not it's worth their time, and by implication, their money. So there you go. We're going to wrap this up for now. This has gone on 3 times, 5 times, 7 times as long as the original video, but I wanted to give you some basics on book reviewing, just because I strongly advise you all to try it. And if you want me to be the person you try it with, feel free. Let me know in the comments field. If you want to try your hand at book reviewing, feel free. And these are the basics to do that. If these basics will guide you well, and then anything more you want to do after that can happen once you've done this about 1,000 times. Do this about 1,000 times, and then you'll be fine. Anyway, I'll wrap this up, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.